Imagine waking up, knowing that if the ships don't arrive, there's a lack of food, a lack of fuel, a lack of everything. That was the reality of England. An island under siege, surrounded by an ocean where dozens of German submarines hunted day and night. On paper, the plan was simple: sink the ships, cut off supplies, and force surrender. Many believed it was only a matter of time, but that time never came. What few people mention is that the Atlantic became a brutal game of intelligence, error, and resistance. While U-boats were sinking cargo ships, something silent was happening on the other side. Decisions made in closed rooms, rapid changes in fighting methods, gambles that seemed desperate. Germany had weapons, submarines, and experienced men. Even so, the blockade failed, and it wasn't luck. It was because, step by step, the plan began to fall apart from the inside. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Because the question isn't just why the submarines didn't win. The question is, at what point did the war at sea turn against them, without the world immediately realizing it? What made an isolated nation continue breathing when everything indicated that it should fall? Stay until the end, because when you understand what really happened in the Atlantic, you'll realize that this was one of the most decisive turning points of the entire war, and almost no one explains it correctly. Have you ever stopped to think, how did an island surrounded by enemy submarines manage to continue receiving food, fuel, and weapons every day? At what point did this silent war in the Atlantic begin to turn around, without announcements, without headlines, but changing the course of history? If this topic captivates you and makes you want to understand what really happened, show it now. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and join those who enjoy well-told history without beating around the bush. And comment below, what city are you watching from? Because this battle wasn't just fought at sea, it involved ordinary people like us, scattered all over the world. When the war began, England did not enter it with a sense of absolute power. It entered with real fear, a silent fear that didn't appear in speeches, but was present at every breakfast table, in every port, in every hushed conversation in queues, because everyone knew one simple and harsh thing: England did not feed itself. It didn't produce enough fuel. It didn't have enough raw materials. It couldn't sustain a modern war without ships arriving every day. And that wasn't a metaphor. If the ships stopped, life stopped too. More than half of the food came from abroad. Coal needed to circulate, oil came by sea, steel depended on maritime routes. Even bread, something basic, was linked to cargo ships crossing the Atlantic. This was no secret to anyone, not to the British government, not to the population, and certainly not to Germany. Therefore, when the first ships began to be sunk, it wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological shock. Each explosion at sea was felt on land as if someone had pulled the handbrake on the entire country. And the most difficult part is that this wasn't a hypothetical scenario. The memory of the First World War was still fresh. People remembered the rationing, the hunger, the feeling of being trapped, waiting for something to end. So, when the new war began and German submarines appeared in the Atlantic, the question wasn't if supplies could be cut off. The question was when. The general feeling was one of a countdown. How many months until food runs out? How long until the fuel runs out? How long until there is no choice left? In the ports, sailors knew that each voyage could be their last. There was no glamour in it. It was hard, tense, repetitive work. Ordinary men boarding ships laden with everything that kept the country alive, knowing that somewhere ahead, someone was waiting for them silently, underwater. In London, the government made cold calculations: how many tons arrived, how many were lost, how long the stockpile would last. None of this appeared on propaganda posters, but it was there, influencing every decision. And yet, the ships continued to sail. Not because it was safe, but because there was no alternative. England couldn't afford to stop. Every train was a gamble, every crossing was a test. and at first the losses hurt. Ships disappeared, crews didn't return, bad news arrived frequently enough to keep the fear constantly burning, but never so high as to paralyze. It was a constant daily tension, almost normalized. The most curious thing is that, despite this fragile scenario, something began to take shape beneath the pressure. Not a miracle, not luck, but a slow, practical response built on necessity. Because when you are totally dependent on something, you quickly learn to protect it. And it is at this point that the story begins to change tone, almost without anyone noticing at first. What seemed like absolute weakness began to force decisions that no one had planned before the war. And it is precisely there, in this silent moment, that the question ceases to be how long until it all ends, but what began to be done while the end seemed inevitable. On the other side of the sea, Germany viewed this British dependence as a clear opportunity. There was no romantic illusion, no grandiose plan. The logic was straightforward. If England lived off what arrived by sea, then it was enough to transform the sea into a deadly place. That's how submarine warfare gained priority. U-boats didn't need to face large fleets, nor win spectacular battles. The objective was colder, to attack cargo ships one by one until the flow stopped. Without food, without fuel, without steel, the war would end on its own. At first, this idea seemed to work. German submarines had range, good commanders, and most importantly, the element of surprise. They appeared where least expected, attacked quickly, and disappeared. For those on merchant ships, it was a feeling of total powerlessness. There was no combat, no chance. A torpedo, a dry explosion, and it was all over in minutes. And each sunken ship was not just a German military victory. It was a clear message to England: you can't protect yourselves. The impact was immediate. Losses increased, the numbers were worrying, and the Atlantic began to gain a reputation as a trap. The most dangerous thing wasn't even the number of submarines, but the feeling that they could be anywhere. For the Germans, this was part of the strategy: to create fear, spread insecurity, force mistakes. Because a country under pressure makes bad decisions. That was the gamble. And for a time, it seemed that the gamble was paying off. However, there was an important detail that rarely appears in quick summaries of history. Germany never had enough submarines to cover everything. Many were under construction, others under maintenance, and still others in training. At sea, at the same time, the real number was much smaller than the propaganda made it seem. This did not eliminate the danger, but it created a silent limitation. For a blockade to truly work, it wasn't enough to sink a few ships. It was necessary to maintain a constant presence, day after day, without fail. And this required a continuous effort that was beginning to take its toll. Furthermore, each submarine operated under extreme conditions. Long weeks at sea, cramped space, constant tension, little margin for error. A poorly calculated attack could be fatal, and even when the attack was successful, the submarine needed to flee, hide, wait. It wasn't an infinite machine. It was a fragile system, sustained by tired men and quick decisions. The more time passed, the more this wear and tear began to show, even if subtly. Meanwhile, in England, each report of a lost ship was analysed with almost obsessive attention, not to dramatize, but to understand patterns, where the attacks were happening, at what times, under what conditions. None of this changed the scenario overnight, but it created something important: learning. And when one side learns while the other insists on the same formula, the balance begins to shift, even if no one notices immediately. The curious thing is that at that point in the war, many still believed it was only a matter of time before British supplies collapsed. The numbers were frightening, the risks were real, and the pressure wasn't letting up. But beneath this tense surface, something was reorganizing itself. Small changes, practical decisions, almost invisible adjustments. Nothing grandiose, nothing cinematic. just responses forged by necessity. And it is precisely this silent process that begins to explain why, despite everything, the blockade never completely closed, and why the next step in this story changes the game in a way few expected. At some point, the war in the Atlantic ceased to be merely a series of attacks and became a problem of mathematics, logistics, and timing. And that's when a truth began to weigh against Germany. It wasn't possible to be everywhere at once. The image of dozens of submarines scattered across the ocean created fear, but it didn't change a simple fact. At sea, their actual presence was limited. For every submarine on patrol, there were others in shipyards undergoing repairs, refueling, or even training crews. The number that actually hunted ships was always smaller than it seemed, and that made a difference. A true blockade requires consistency. It demands that the enemy never rest, never have a safe corridor, never know when they will pass unscathed. But the Atlantic was too vast, and the U-boats were too few to cover everything. When a submarine attacked, it had to move away. When it sank a ship, it revealed its presence, and each movement created breaches, gaps that at first seemed too small to matter, but which over time began to add up. Furthermore, there was a delay that could no longer be corrected. Before the war, Germany had not fully committed to submarines. The heavy investment came too late. When the conflict truly began, there was no fleet ready to withstand years of continuous pressure. Building submarines took time, training crews took even longer, and the war did not wait. Every month lost before 1939 now exacted a high price. Meanwhile, on the British side, the reading was cold. It wasn't about bravery or rhetoric. It was about survival. If submarines couldn't be everywhere, then the objective became simple: reduce risk wherever possible, not to eliminate the danger, because that was impossible at that moment, but to reduce the chances of loss. And this practical mindset began to shape decisions that seemed small, but changed everything in the long run. The Germans were still sinking ships, still causing damage, still spreading fear, but each loss was beginning to cost more. A lost submarine was not easily replaced. An experienced commander killed was not replaced for weeks. Gradually the balance began to tip. Not spectacularly, not overnight, but steadily, almost imperceptibly. Submarine warfare demanded continuous perfection. Any mistake accumulated. And then there was the human factor. Inside the U-boats, the pressure didn't let up. Long missions, absolute silence, constant tension. Every shadow could be a ship, every noise a threat. Over time, this took its toll. Decisions became riskier. Attacks more cautious, retreats more frequent. None of this appears in graphs, but all of it influences the outcome. On the other hand, each ship that managed to cross the Atlantic reinforced a dangerous idea for Germany. The system was still working. Even wounded, even under pressure, England continued to receive what it needed. Not in excess, not in abundance, but enough to continue. And, in war, continuing is already a form of victory. The most critical point is that while Germany was trying to intensify what it was already doing, England was beginning to think differently, not only about how to react, but about how to change the game itself. The sea remained dangerous, the risks were still enormous, but something was adjusting, and when adjustments begin to accumulate, they create an effect that only becomes clear later. It is precisely at this moment, when German limitations meet British adaptation, that history enters a new phase, a phase in which protecting becomes as important as attacking, and where the next step will redefine who truly controlled the Atlantic. What really began to weigh against Germany was something that could no longer be corrected in the midst of war: the choices made before it begins. When fighting broke out in 1939, Germany did not enter the conflict with a submarine fleet prepared to sustain a long and total blockade. For years, the priority had been elsewhere: Large surface ships, ambitious projects, plans that presupposed quick and decisive wars. The idea of a prolonged confrontation in the Atlantic day after day, year after year, simply had not been taken to its ultimate consequences. This created a structural problem. Submarines don't just appear out of nowhere. They require shipyards, steel, engines, complex systems, and most importantly, well-trained crews. When the war truly began, Germany rushed to accelerate production, but war does not forgive delays. Each new U-boat that entered service carried men with less experience than those who had already been lost. And at sea, experience is not a detail, it's survival. Meanwhile, England didn't have the luxury of making mistakes in its planning. Dependence on the sea forced a different mindset from the start. It wasn't a matter of elegant, strategic choice, it was a necessity. Either maritime trade was protected, or the country simply ground to a halt. This urgency shaped quick, sometimes improvised decisions, but always focused on a clear objective: keep the ships sailing. The contrast became increasingly apparent over time. Germany needed a quick victory in the Atlantic for its strategy to work, but the initial delay meant the effort would have to be sustained for longer. Exactly the kind of warfare submarines weren't prepared to sustain on a full scale. Each additional month favored whoever could learn, adapt, and produce more. And that didn't work in the Germans' favor. There was also a less visible, but equally serious problem: coordination. Submarine warfare required constant communication, information exchange, and quick decisions based on reliable data. But the more submarines that came into operation, the more complex this became. And any communication failure meant convoys escaping, missed opportunities, and poorly positioned attacks. The plan seemed strong on paper, but in practice it depended on a precision that was almost impossible to maintain under constant pressure. From the British side, every German failure was observed closely. There was no excessive celebration because the danger remained real, but there was learning. If an attack occurred on a particular route, that route was reconsidered. If a pattern emerged, it was studied. Gradually, England began to act not only defensively, but intelligently, not trying to confront the enemy head-on, but exploring its limitations. And here a crucial point arises. Germany needed everything to go right almost all the time. England only needed the system to function sufficiently. This difference changes everything. A total blockade demands perfection, survival demands resilience, and resilience allows for error, adjustment, correction. Over time, this asymmetry began to take its toll. Even when the number of sunken ships was still staggering, something was already changing beneath the surface. The German effort was becoming increasingly expensive, riskier, and less efficient. The British, even under pressure, were beginning to gain momentum. And when a war enters this kind of dynamic, it doesn't usually turn around all at once. It shifts slowly until one day it becomes clear that control is no longer where it seemed to be. It is at this point that the story begins to take a step beyond the simple dispute between submarines and cargo ships, because England was not just going to react, it was going to organize, systematize, and protect. And when this change happens, the game ceases to be a free-for-all in the ocean and becomes something much more difficult for those hidden underwater. It is precisely this movement that begins to take shape next, and that will explain why the Atlantic never closed completely. The turning point began to take shape when England stopped treating each ship as an isolated case and started to see the problem as a whole system. Until then, many cargo ships still sailed alone, or with limited protection, relying on luck, silence, or speed. This worked poorly. An isolated ship was an easy target. A submarine needed only a few minutes to attack and disappear, and each loss reinforced the feeling of vulnerability. It was at this point that a practical, almost obvious decision began to be applied with much more rigor. The ships would no longer sail alone. The convoy system wasn't entirely new, but now it had become the norm. Merchant ships began crossing the Atlantic in organized groups with set schedules, planned routes, and constant escorts. This didn't eliminate the danger, but it completely changed the dynamics. For a submarine, attacking a convoy was much riskier than attacking an isolated target. After the first shot, the submarine had to flee, and now there were armed ships, alert and prepared to react. The attack ceased to be clean and became a game of risk. Initially, there was resistance. Trains were slower. They required coordination. They created bottlenecks in ports. Many questioned whether this wouldn't make life easier for submarines, concentrating targets instead of spreading them out. But, in practice, began to prove better than any debate. Even when a ship was hit, the train continued. The cargo didn't all disappear at once, and more importantly, submarines were forced to expose themselves for longer, increasing the chances of error. For British sailors, this changed the feeling at sea. The fear didn't disappear, but it ceased to be solitary. Sailing in groups brought a form of practical confidence. There was someone watching, someone listening, someone ready to act. Each escort represented not only protection, but also discipline, stricter routines, constant communication, less improvisation. All this reduced the chances of total surprise, which was the submarine's greatest weapon. From the German perspective, the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Attacking convoys required greater coordination among the U-boats themselves, better communication, and perfect timing. Any delay could mean losing the opportunity or entering into a dangerous confrontation. And the more escorts were added, the greater the risk became. A detected submarine could quickly turn from hunter to prey. Another important detail is that the trains allowed for something essential: collective learning. Each attack, each failed attempt, each suspicious contact generated information. This information circulated, was analyzed, and routes and procedures were adjusted. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a living system that improved over time. Unlike a lone attack, where each mistake died with the ship, now the experience was shared. The psychological effect also began to change. For the population, knowing that the ships were traveling under protection brought a minimal sense of control. It didn't guarantee success, but it showed that there was an organized response. For the enemy, each convoy crossing the Atlantic was uncomfortable proof that supplies weren't collapsing. They were holding out. It's important to understand that none of this solved the problem all at once. Ships continued to be sunk, lives continued to be lost, but the trend began to change. The cost of each attack increased, the gain decreased, and in war that's crucial. When attacking becomes too expensive, the strategy begins to fail, and something even deeper was happening. By organizing the convoys, England was doing more than defending itself. It was creating a solid base to integrate new ideas, new technologies, and new allies. The sea was ceasing to be merely a hunting ground and was becoming a controlled, observed, and studied space. This control was still fragile, but it was growing. That's exactly where the story starts to accelerate. Because when you create order in the midst of chaos, you open the door to something even more dangerous for those who live in hiding: detection, anticipation, and rapid reaction. And what comes next is no longer just human organization, but a technical change that will transform the ocean floor into an increasingly unsafe place for those who believed they were invisible. From the moment trains became the norm, a new need became clear. It wasn't enough to navigate together. It was necessary to see what was hidden. Until then, much of the war in the Atlantic was fought in the dark. Submarines attacked because they were unseen. They relied on silence, surprise, and the enemy's difficulty in knowing where they were. It was precisely this advantage that began to be attacked head-on, not with speeches, but with tools. The focus became simple and direct: detect the submarine before it attacked. And that changed everything. Listening equipment began to be used more systematically. It wasn't perfect. It failed. It required experienced operators, but it worked well enough to change the game. Suddenly, the ocean was no longer so silent. Strange sounds began to be tracked. Patterns began to be recognized. Suspicions turned into actions. It was no longer necessary to see the submarine to know it was there. This brought about a brutal change in the routine of U-boats. Before, they could navigate long stretches with relative freedom, surfacing to recharge batteries, observe the horizon, and reposition themselves. Now, every minute exposed was a real risk. Planes, escorts, sensors. The submarine was forced to remain submerged for longer periods, which limited its speed, its vision, and its ability to react. The hunter began to feel cornered. Depth charges entered this scenario as a heavy psychological factor. It wasn't necessary to hit directly. Pressure was enough. Nearby explosions shook the hull, broke equipment, injured crew members, and, above all, wore down their nerves. A submarine under attack had to choose between fleeing blindly or remaining motionless, waiting for the worst. Every wrong decision could be fatal, and over time, these situations ceased to be rare. For those who escorted the trains, the logic also changed. The mission was no longer just to accompany them. It was actively hunt. Whenever a suspicious contact arose, the escort would detach from the convoy and begin the pursuit. This created a hostile environment for the submarines. Even when they weren't destroyed, they were driven away, forced to retreat, prevented from attacking. The practical effect was simple. Fewer torpedoes launched, fewer ships sunk. The most important detail is that this evolution didn't happen automatically. It was built on mistakes, many false contacts, many unsuccessful attacks, many frustrated attempts. But each failure taught something. Adjustments were made, procedures changed, operators became more experienced. Gradually, the success rate increased, and in parallel, the submarine's room for maneuver decreased. From the German side, this began to create a serious problem. Each patrol became more dangerous. Each mission required more caution. Time spent avoiding escorts was time lost without attacking, and the more caution, the less impact. The submarine was still a powerful weapon, but it was ceasing to be a constant threat. The initiative was beginning to slip. There's a fundamental psychological point here. Submarine warfare depended on the feeling of invisibility. When that feeling begins to fail, everything changes. Crews become more tense. Decisions become more conservative. Opportunities are lost. And meanwhile, on the other side, confidence grows. Not naive confidence, but practical confidence. The confidence of those who realize they are learning to survive better with each crossing. It's important to make it clear, the Atlantic was still dangerous. Ships continued to be attacked, men continued to die, but the balance was beginning to shift. Not in headlines, not in big announcements, but in the silent numbers. Fewer losses per convoy, more submarines damaged, more attacks thwarted before they could happen. And this advance created something even more decisive. Time to adapt routes, time to train better, time to produce more escorts, time to integrate new solutions. In war, time is everything. And each day that British supplies continued to arrive was another day to strengthen that system. It is precisely at this point that the story begins to gain an even deeper layer, because when you start to detect the enemy, the next step is to anticipate their movements. And when you anticipate, you stop reacting and start to control. What was being built there was not just defense. It was something much more dangerous for those who depended on secrecy. And the next chapter shows how invisible information began to decide battles that no one saw happening. What truly began to dismantle the German strategy was something that made no noise, left no debris in the sea, and didn't appear to the sailors looking at the horizon. While submarines were still trying to hunt convoys, another war was raging far away, in closed rooms, desks full of papers, tired people staring at numbers, patterns, and seemingly meaningless messages. It was there that the Atlantic began to be controlled, even before any ship left port. For a long time, the Germans trusted that their communications were secure. Orders were transmitted, positions were updated, attacks were coordinated based on this constant exchange of information. For submarine warfare to work, this was essential. An isolated U-boat had little impact. The real danger came when several submarines were directed to the same route at the same time. But this system depended on something fragile. Tishi's enemy could not understand what was being said. From the moment that started to fail, everything changed. Without immediately realizing it, Germany began to talk too much. Information that should have been secret began to be deciphered, cross-referenced, analyzed. Predicted routes, areas of attack, planned movements. None of this reached the sea as an explicit order saying, "The submarine is there." It arrived as practical decisions. Diverted convoys, altered routes, reinforced escorts where there seemed to be no danger. To those who were navigating, it seemed like intuition. To those who observed the entire system, it was pure intelligence. The effect of this was devastating for the logic of submarine warfare. Many attacks simply failed to happen because the target never appeared. Convoys passed far from the most dangerous areas without knowing exactly why. Submarines waited for days in positions where nothing emerged. Fuel was wasted, time was lost, crews became exhausted. And all this without the Germans clearly understanding the reason. From their point of view, the sea seemed to suddenly become empty. At the same time, when an attack actually happened, the British reaction began to seem too quick. Escorts appeared with unsettling precision. Patrols showed up where they shouldn't be. For submarine commanders, this created a disturbing feeling that the enemy knew more than they should, and that feeling, in war, erodes confidence. You begin to hesitate, to distrust every order, to imagine traps where perhaps none exist, and every hesitation costs opportunities. This type of advantage isn't measured solely in ships sunk or preserved. You measure it in control. Whoever knows where the other side will be decides when to fight and when to avoid. And that's exactly what began to happen. England didn't need to win every confrontation. It was enough to avoid the worst ones. It was enough to ensure that the flow was never completely interrupted. Each train that arrived intact was a silent victory, built long before it touched the water. What's most impressive is that all of this worked without most people being aware of it. Sailors followed orders, captains changed routes, ports adjusted, and the machine kept turning. On the other side, Germany saw its results dwindle without fully understanding why. The initial sense of advantage began to disappear, replaced by frustration and exhaustion. This type of war is cruel precisely for that reason. It doesn't offer a clear moment of defeat. There isn't one big battle lost all at once. There's a sequence of small failures, small delays, small frustrations that added together dismantle the entire strategy. And when that happens, it doesn't matter how many submarines still exist. The system no longer functions as it once did. And most importantly, this invisible advantage gave England something precious: risk predictability. Knowing where danger was likely to lurk allowed them to concentrate forces, conserve resources, and better protect what was essential. It wasn't invincibility, it was enough control to keep breathing. But this new layer of warfare created a chain reaction, because when you start anticipating the enemy, you can do more than just avoid them. You can surround them, pressure them, and gradually transform each enemy mission into an increasingly dangerous gamble. And that's exactly where the next step really starts to weigh on you, when the sea ceases to be just a passageway and begins to be watched from above as well. closing a gap that for a long time kept submarines alive. When the United States entered the war, the Atlantic ceased to be merely a matter of British survival and became a full-scale industrial challenge. Until then, England had been resisting, adapting, buying time. With the American arrival, something changes dramatically. It's not an emotional or symbolic change. It's pure mathematics. Production, volume, pace. A kind of force that submarines simply cannot keep up with. From that moment on, the logic of naval warfare began to turn against Germany almost inevitably. Each sunken ship was still a painful loss, but now there was something new on the horizon. Ships were being built faster than they could be destroyed. Shipyards operating non-stop, production lines streamlined, projects designed not to last for decades but to fulfill a clear and immediate function. Transport cargo, get to the other side, return, repeat. This completely changes the strategic impact of German attacks. Before, sinking a cargo ship meant creating a hole that was difficult to fill. Now, it meant delaying something that was already being replenished. The psychological effect also changes. The feeling of scarcity begins to diminish, not because the danger is over, but because the system gains breathing room. England ceases to operate at its absolute limit and begins to have some leeway, albeit a small one. At the same time, the American presence reinforces the escort in a concrete way. More ships, more crews, more cover. The ocean begins to shrink for those who live hidden underwater. Routes that were once long and vulnerable now have constant protection. Coordination improves. Information circulates faster. The Atlantic, which once seemed too vast to control, begins to seem too organized to be explored freely. From the German perspective, this creates a serious problem of scale. A submarine can sink a few ships on a successful patrol, but it can't compete with an industry that operates at a different pace. Each mission takes on greater weight because the results need to justify the increasing risk. And, at the same time, the chances of success decrease. More escorts, more planes, more eyes watching. There is also a detail that is often overlooked. The fatigue of the German system submarines are not disposable in the same sense as simplified cargo ships. Each German loss represents months of work, specialized resources, and men trained for years. Each loss there hurts more than the loss of a merchant ship on the other side, and little by little, this asymmetry is becoming unsustainable. Meanwhile, for those on the British side, the feeling at sea begins to subtly but noticeably change. The risk still exists, but the crossing no longer feels like absolute Russian roulette. There are more escorts around, more air protection, more confidence in the procedures. It's not tranquility, it's increasing control. And control in war is everything. Another important point is that this logistical expansion is not limited to ships. It supports everything that comes with it. More fuel for escorts, more spare parts, more training, more time at sea without needing to retreat. The system ceases to operate on improvisation and begins to operate with continuous planning, something that Germany, under pressure and limited resources, is beginning to have difficulty keeping up with. And the more this system grows, the more it exposes the fragility of the original German plan. Submarine warfare worked best when the enemy was weak, isolated, and racing against the clock. Now the clock was starting to tick against the submarines themselves. Each additional month made the ocean more hostile, more monitored, more predictable for those on the surface. The cruelest thing for Germany is that there wasn't a clear, now it's over moment. There wasn't a major, immediate collapse. There was a gradual feeling that the impact was no longer the same. Fewer results, more losses, more frustration. And in war, when you realize you're trying harder to have less effect, something is deeply wrong. And there was still one piece that would make this scenario almost definitive. Because if the sea was already becoming too dangerous below and too organized on the surface, It was about to be closed off from above for good. A void that for a long time allowed submarines to breathe was beginning to disappear. And when that happens, the advantage of silence simply ceases to exist. The last great respite for submarines was the sky. For a long time, there were vast areas of the Atlantic where no Allied planes could get through. It was there that the U-boats felt safest. They could surface, recharge batteries, observe the horizon, reposition themselves, and prepare attacks. While this air vacuum existed, submarine warfare still had momentum, but this vacuum began to disappear, and when that happened, the entire logic of warfare at sea changed forever. The expansion of air reach transformed the Atlantic into a completely different environment. Patrol planes began to cover areas that were previously practically free for submarines. It wasn't necessary to sink them immediately. It was enough. Find them a sighted submarine was a submarine in danger. From that moment on, it needed to dive, lose speed, lose visibility, and above all, lose initiative. The time that was previously used to attack was now spent simply trying to survive. This had a devastating effect on the efficiency of U-boats. Submarines depended on the surface to operate well. Submerged, they were slow, limited, and vulnerable. The longer they spent underwater, the less they could act. And now, surfacing during the day was almost an invitation to disaster. Planes appeared quickly, attacked without warning, and called for escorts. The ocean ceased to be a hiding place and became a space watched from top to bottom. For the German crews, this completely altered the experience of patrolling. Fear ceased to be sporadic and became constant. It was no longer just the moment of attack that brought risk. It was every hour, every decision, every attempt to surface. The psychological strain increased. Missions became longer, more tense, and less productive. Many submarines returned to base without even having fired a torpedo. On the Allied side, the air presence brought something essential. Continuity escorts at sea had limitations. They needed to stay close to the convoys. Airplanes didn't. They could cover large areas, detect movements, close routes, and push submarines into increasingly unfavorable zones. When an airplane located a U-boat, it didn't need to handle everything alone. It simply had to mark the position, maintain pressure, and wait for naval forces to arrive. The submarine, trapped underwater, was left with few good options. The impact of this becomes clear over time. German losses begin to mount at an alarming rate, not because the Allies suddenly became brilliant, but because the environment became too hostile for those who depended on secrecy. Each patrol turned into a game of survival, no longer of attack. And when your main weapon ceases to attack, it loses its strategic meaning. Another important detail is that this aerial surveillance did not require perfection. It only needed to be constant. Even when there was no direct contact, the mere risk of being seen forced submarines to change their behavior, avoiding areas, delaying attacks, abandoning pursuits. All this further reduced the real impact of submarine warfare. The threat continued to exist, but increasingly as a potential, not as a concrete result. Meanwhile, for the trains, the sky began to represent something new: anticipation, the chance to detect danger before it approached. This didn't eliminate the risk, but it drastically reduced the element of surprise. And, unsurprisingly, the submarine loses its greatest advantage. What was once a silent and invisible weapon becomes a pressured, limited, and increasingly predictable presence. At this point, the war in the Atlantic was no longer balanced. There were still attacks, there were still losses, but the trend was clear. The German effort was growing while the results were dwindling. Each new submarine launched faced an environment worse than the last, and in war, fighting in conditions that only worsen is the shortest path to collapse. The most significant thing is that all of this happened without a formal announcement of victory. There wasn't a specific day when anyone said the submarines had lost. There was only one moment when it became clear that a complete lockdown would never happen. The supply continued, the system held up, and Germany was beginning to pay too high a price for increasingly smaller results. And when this reality sets in, the war enters its final phase at sea. Because from that point on, it's no longer about trying to win, but about trying to minimize losses. And it is at this point that the numbers, cold and relentless, begin to tell a story that leaves no room for doubt. A story that clearly shows when and why the balance finally tipped. There comes a point in every war when numbers begin to speak louder than any discourse. In the Atlantic, that moment arrived when the losses ceased to be merely painful and became unequal. For a time, sinking merchant ships still seemed to compensate for the risk. But, little by little, this equation began to break down. Submarines were being lost at a rate that no longer made strategic sense. Each mission returned shorter, emptier, more dangerous. And this wasn't just an impression, it was a trend. The reports began to reveal something troubling for Germany. The number of British and Allied ships sunk per convoy was falling, not reaching zero, but falling consistently. At the same time, the number of submarines that failed to return to base was increasing. And here's the key point. A lost cargo ship was tragic but replaceable. A lost submarine took with it months of work, complex materials, and most importantly, an entire crew that could not be quickly replaced. Each German loss weighed more than it appeared on paper. For U-boat commanders, this began to change the climate of operations. Before, the focus was on attacking. Now, it was on surviving. The silent priority shifted from causing maximum damage to returning alive. This is reflected in smaller decisions. Fewer long pursuits, less insistence on difficult targets, more preemptive retreats. All of this further reduces the real impact of submarine warfare. The system begins to protect itself instead of applying pressure. From the British side, the situation was clear. The supply wasn't intact, but it was stable enough, and that was all that mattered. It wasn't necessary to conquer the Atlantic spectacularly. It was enough to prevent collapse. It was enough to maintain the minimum necessary flow. Each month that this happened strengthened the system as a whole. More ships in operation, more experienced escorts, more integration between sea and air. The machine became more efficient precisely while the German one wore down. There's an important detail here. This turning point doesn't happen in a single year, nor in a single battle. It's built through repetition, convoy after convoy, patrol after patrol. When you look at it in isolation, each episode seems small. But when you add it all up, the picture changes completely. Submarine warfare ceases to be an existential threat and becomes a serious, yet controllable problem. And this change in status is decisive. For the English population, this did not mean absolute tranquility. Rationing continued, bad news still appeared. But there was something different at the heart of it all. The country continued to function. The factories didn't stop. The cities didn't collapse. The fuel arrived. The food arrived. Not in excess, but enough. And in war, enough is victory. For Germany, the situation was becoming increasingly unfavorable. Intensifying the attacks meant further exposing the submarines. Retreating meant admitting that the plan wasn't working. There was no clean way out. Each decision seemed worse than the last, and when a strategy reaches that point, it ceases to be sustainable. The hardest part is that all of this happened while the world was still talking about the U-boat threat as something gigantic. The image was bigger than the reality at that stage. In practice, the war in the Atlantic had already passed the tipping point. The total blockade had not only failed, it was no longer possible. The cost was too high, the return too low, the environment too hostile. And when this kind of realization sets in, the nature of war changes. It ceases to be about conquering something and becomes about limit damage. It is at this point that it becomes clear that England was not merely resisting. It had already passed through the most critical period. What remained now was to maintain this advantage and transform survival into a foundation for something greater, because maintaining supplies wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new phase, a phase in which England ceased fighting alone and became the focal point of a much larger offensive. And understanding this is essential to realizing why the German failure in the Atlantic wasn't just a naval defeat, but a key piece in everything that would come after. When all these factors come together, it becomes impossible to pinpoint a single reason for the German failure in the Atlantic. And that is precisely the key to understanding why England's supplies were never truly cut off. It wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a set of limitations that were reinforced over time until the blocking becomes simply unfeasible. Germany relied on a strategy that demanded continuous perfection. To function, the submarines needed to always be in the right place, at the right time, in sufficient numbers, with secure communications, experienced crews, and a disorganized enemy. Any failure in this system weakened the whole, and the failures began to accumulate. Few submarines at sea at any one time, late production, human attrition, difficulty in coordination, loss of the element of surprise. Each element in isolation did not seem decisive, but together they created an impossible burden to sustain. Meanwhile, England operated under a different logic. It didn't need to eliminate the threat completely. It needed to hold on. We needed to keep the minimum necessary supplies reaching the ports. This difference in objectives changed everything. A total blockade demands absolute success. Survival accepts losses as long as the system continues to function. And that's exactly what happened. Even under constant pressure, the supply never stopped completely. There was scarcity, there was rationing, there was fear, but there was no collapse. Another crucial point is that Germany never managed to dictate the pace of the war in the Atlantic for long enough. Initially, it had an advantage, but it couldn't make it permanent. Each Allied advance, convoys, escorts, technology, intelligence, industrial support, removed some of that advantage. And what doesn't renew itself in war eventually disappears. German submarine warfare couldn't reinvent itself quickly enough to keep up with the changing environment. Furthermore, there was an asymmetry that was difficult to ignore. For the Allies, losing a ship was tragic, but the system absorbed it. For Germany, losing a submarine was a profound blow. Specialized resources, construction time, experienced men. Each German loss reduced not only the present, but the future of the strategy. This created a negative cycle. Fewer experienced submarines led to less effective missions, which led to more losses, which further weakened the system. And there is also the factor of continuous adaptation. England and its allies learned on the move. They adjusted routes, changed procedures, corrected flaws. None of it was perfect, but it was constant. Germany, on the other hand, was stuck with an idea that worked better at the beginning than at the end. When it tried to change, it was already reacting, no longer controlling. In war, those who react too much usually arrive too late. In the end, the blockade failed because the Atlantic was never fully dominated. There were always loopholes. There were always alternative routes. There were always ships passing through. And each ship that arrived weakened the logic of the blockade. England didn't win because it was untouchable, but because it managed to keep the system alive long enough for the overall balance of the war to shift in its favor. The most important thing is to realize that this German failure wasn't dramatic in the classical sense. There wasn't a specific day when everything collapsed. There was a slow, silent, almost invisible erosion. A plan that seemed powerful became too expensive, too risky, and ultimately too useless. When this became clear, Germany no longer had any way to reverse the situation at sea. And it is precisely at this point that the story takes on an even greater significance. Because maintaining the supply was not just about surviving. It was to create the necessary conditions for everything that came after. England continued fighting, served as a base, supported allies, and kept the door open for a much greater turning point. Understanding this helps to see the Atlantic not as a detail of the war, but as one of the places where the fate of the conflict was decided without most people realizing it. When you look at all of this together, it becomes clear that the German failure to cut off England's supplies was neither a technical detail nor a historical accident. It was a direct consequence of resistance, adaptation, and time. England didn't win the Atlantic because it was invulnerable. It won because it didn't fall when it should have fallen, according to all initial calculations. And that difference changes the course of an entire war. Keeping the ships arriving meant keeping factories running, cities breathing, soldiers training, and allies believing. It meant not only surviving, but remain standing when logic dictated that falling was inevitable. Each train that crossed the ocean carried more than just food or fuel. It carried time, and time in that war was the most powerful weapon of all. While Germany struggled to maintain a strategy that demanded perfection, England built something simpler and more effective, a system that accepted losses but never stopped. A system that learned from every mistake and grew a little stronger each month. There were no easy victories, no absolute security. There was persistence. There was discipline. There were tough decisions made without any guarantee of immediate success. That's why the Atlantic was so decisive. It wasn't just a naval battle. It was a test of who could endure longer under extreme pressure. And when that test ended, England was still there, wounded, rationed, tired, but functioning. Germany, on the other hand, had already spent too many men, resources, and opportunities trying something it never managed to complete. From this point on, the rest of the war begins to make sense. England becomes a base, a bridge, a support. The Allies begin to plan larger offensives because they know that the essentials are guaranteed. None of this would have been possible if supplies had been cut off. Nothing. Without the open Atlantic, there would have been no continuity, no accumulation of force, no strategic turning point on the European continent. What's most impressive is that this victory wasn't celebrated in a single day. It didn't have a set date. It was built in the silence of the seas, in the routine of the ports, in the repetitive work of ordinary people who continued sailing even when everything indicated that it shouldn't work. It's a victory without spectacle, but without it, no other would have been possible. And perhaps that's what makes this story so powerful. Germany had submarines, technology, audacity. England had need, and in war, necessity often teaches faster. Supplies were never cut off because while one side bet on strangulation, the other bet on to resist until the game changed, and when it changed, it was too late to go back. In the end, the Atlantic proved a simple and harsh truth. Wars are not won solely with impressive weapons, but with systems that can withstand attrition. And that is precisely what kept England fighting and paved the way for everything that came after. What did you think of this story? Does it make sense to you to understand the Atlantic not as a single battle, but as a daily struggle of resistance, adaptation, and time? Leave your comment below because your perspective completes this story and helps others see what often goes unnoticed. If this content has captivated you so far, a like shows that it's worth continuing to bring you stories told with depth and truth. Subscribe to the channel and keep following, because there are still many inspiring, decisive, and little explained stories waiting to be told here.